Yeah, when I was sending out notes to people this week, I accidentally typed Matthew, and if you did read that, or if you're familiar with the passage, it's a genealogy, and it's this list of names, and it's being the person who gets tapped to read those things out loud on a Sunday morning is a bit of a challenge. So I realized later I had actually intended Mark chapter 1. So yeah, sorry to scare you. So we are in a series of messages right now where we're looking at how to read the Bible. Some of us are somewhat new to this text. Some of us have been reading it for a long time, and maybe we could use a reminder of some principles, some basics of, where do I start? Where do I even start with this amazing book that people keep telling me I should read it? Where do I start? How do I understand it? And what does it matter? Why should I bother? Last week, Paul was sort of co-preaching, and he mentioned this phrase that I really like. This phrase is, where the Bible goes, literacy follows. Where the Bible goes, literacy follows. And that started a long time ago. That philosophy started a long time ago in the 1500s. Started at a time in the life of the church that we call the Reformation, and I'm not going to get into a lot of details on that, but it was sparked by a man named Martin Luther. The name may be familiar to you. Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King Jr., Martin Luther, the first one, the original, was a monk in the 1500s. He was a priest, and he became a pastor to people. And I want to show you this first slide. This is a page from Martin Luther's translation of the Bible, and if you're having a hard time reading that, it's not because your eyes are going, it's because it's in German. He translated it from the original languages, Greek and Hebrew, and also at the time Latin was available. He translated it into German. It had originally been, the Bible was available in Hebrew and Greek and Latin, because at the time when it was created, those were common languages. Those were the languages that people spoke in the streets. Those were the water cooler language, the grocery store language was Latin, which is kind of a bit of a mind bend for me, but that was the common tongue. But over the centuries, civilizations had shifted, languages had evolved, but the Bible and the worship of the church, the gathered worship of the church, had remained only available in Latin, which meant that the majority of people just were not going to be able to read it. Even if they could get a copy of the Bible in their hands, they would not be able to read it. The Bible and the worship of God remained in Latin and could only be interpreted for people by priests, because priests were taught Latin. So Luther and a bunch of his compatriots, a bunch of like-minded people, got together and they challenged that. And they said, every Christian is capable of interpreting freely and individually for themselves what it says in the Bible. And that means that every Christian can become a priest for themselves. This was an important value for the reformers, headed up by Martin Luther and a few of his contemporaries. So Luther and his friends recognized they could read Latin. They knew how to read Latin. He was a monk. He had been taught the language. He was capable of reading it. But he wanted everybody else to be able to read it too. So he recognized that to get Bibles into people's hands, to get people reading the Bible, there were sort of two major roadblocks, a general one and a particular one. So the first roadblock to getting the Bible into people's hands was the general problem of literacy. In the 1500s, the kind of education that we just take for granted, that we just assume is going to happen in our childhood, didn't exist. It was only available to people who were rich and powerful, the upper echelons of society, people who were influential, people who were in the nobility. Their children could attend schools. Their children could be taught to read and write. The vast majority of people, pretty much everybody in this room, would have been illiterate. And we would have been then depending on the rich and the powerful to interpret the world for us, to tell us what the Bible said, to tell us what the laws were, to tell us how we were to live. We were dependent on them because we could not read or write for ourselves. So Martin Luther and his friends just thought, okay, that is not okay. They believed that literacy should be available to, and this is their phrase, to the mother in the home, the children on the street, and the common man in the marketplace. And this was the birth of public schools. Public schools began in churches. On Sunday afternoons, children would work for the family firm, the family farm, whatever it was, all week long. But on Sundays, when the church said they weren't allowed to work, kids could come to school. And they could learn to read and to write. And this is a value that continued for centuries. I want to show you this slide. This is like an attendance board that I took a picture of that lives in Port Hope First Baptist Church, next door to us. This is, it says across the top there, Baptist Sunday School, organized 1855. This was the same kind of a school because this kind of work continued through the centuries. And this school started meeting 300 years after Martin Luther's started. They would meet from 2:30 to 4 on Sunday afternoons. And the first time they took attendance, their first attendance, they noted down the presence of 2 male teachers, 4 female teachers, 11 male students, 20 female students, of whom one was 70 years old, who just wanted to learn to read and write. Where the Bible goes, literacy follows. The second challenge that Martin Luther recognized in getting the Bible into the hands and into the hearts and the minds of people was a particular problem that he felt that he could address. In his work to let Christians interpret freely and individually the Bible for themselves, he recognized that it only existed in the ancient languages. It was only in Hebrew and Greek and Latin, and the vast majority of people in Germany at the time did not understand those languages. The Bible did not exist in the common tongue. So Luther and his team worked away for nearly 10 years of teamwork, handwriting, translating the Bible from the original languages into German. And I want to show you this quote that I found this week. I got a kick out of this. Martin Luther says, "I have undertaken to translate the Bible into German. This was good for me. Otherwise, I might have died in the mistaken notion that I was a learned fellow. I might have died thinking I was smart. Good thing I decided to try to translate the Bible." So the people who Martin was working with, first of all, they needed to learn to read their own language. Then they needed a text that was available in their own language. And this was a great passion for these people because there is something about this book. There is something about this book that needs to be in the hands of people who can actually read it for themselves. Martin Luther and his compatriots said, you know what, this book is so important, we are going to spend our lives teaching you how to read so that you can read this. This was not an era of news magazines and newspapers and paperback novels on a rack in the pharmacy. There weren't a lot of books around. If you were going to be reading, you were going to be reading the Bible. So last week we did a bit of a general information, kind of an overview of what is the Bible. Like, what is this thing? Well, the Bible is a book, sort of. It was written over 1.5 millennia. It was written over the course of 1,500 years by a succession of over 40 writers, recording the voices and the lives of generations of people. The Bible, as we recognize it, is a collection of 66 books. And I had to memorize this when I was a kid, and I'm going to go for it, and I'm going to try to recite the books. You're laughing at me, Stephanie. I'm going to try to recite the books. So if I get hung up, somebody has to come to my rescue, okay? So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Malachi, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. First and second. Colossians. What comes after Colossians? First and 2nd Thessalonians, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, Philemon, Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st and 2nd, 3rd John, Jude, and Revelation. Woo! And there's a song that goes with that, and every now and then if I'm trying to find something in the Bible, I have to sing the song, like starting at the beginning so that I can get, anyway. Woo! Phew. All right, so, and in those 66 books, we read history, we read poetry, we read law, we read prophecy and instruction and wisdom. We read the words and experiences of men and women from every walk of life. The Bible, in the King James translation into English, the Bible contains 780,000 words. 780,000 words. That is longer than War and Peace, in case you were wondering. It is, in fact, and I double-checked this, it is more words than The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King, all, I know, right? All together. To read the Bible from cover to cover, it would take about an average of 67 hours. So 3 days of reading. And you're thinking, you're telling me that I have to read this? Well, no, I'm not telling you you have to read this, but I will tell you that you really, really should. The Bible is not a tidy book. It's not a comfortable book. It's not neatly organized like a topical kind of a textbook with tidy sections of information. It's not organized alphabetically. It's not even entirely chronological. It's not like a traditional history where the narrative unfolds from event to event with sort of conveniently placed bits of exposition in the transitions to help us understand how did we get from there to there. The Bible is not always a happy book. The Bible is not always a particularly optimistic book. Paul and I were listening to a preacher this week, I think it was John Mark Comer, and he said when he reads the book of Ecclesiastes, he always feels like it must have been written by an atheist. If you've read Ecclesiastes, you might get what he means. But the Bible does contain honest stories about complicated families, stories about war, about national identity, about running away from or standing to face danger, stories of villains and victims and property disputes and political wrangling and what to do if I think somebody stole my cow. Some of the writings in the Bible are simple and clear. Some of them are bold and unambiguous. But a lot of it is deep in symbolism, with roots in ancient cultures. There are actual words in the Bible whose meaning is completely forgotten. We're guessing when we translate certain individual words. There are place names in the Bible for places that are otherwise completely lost to history. We have no idea where they were. What the Bible is is an organically human, divinely shaped collection of incredibly diverse writings that sometimes, to be honest, stand in tension with each other, and that very often leave us with more questions than answers. And I know this isn't much of a sales pitch, but yeah, you really should read this book. Because woven throughout it, woven through all the strangeness and the diversity and the ugly honesty and the tension and the questions, woven throughout all of that, there is no gaslighting, there are no ads, there's no AI, there is just a baseline for what it is to be human and a baseline for truth. So yeah, you really should read this book. So assuming I haven't scared you off yet, and assuming that you're not wanting to stay awake for 3 days straight to burn through it, cover to cover, you may be wondering, where do I start? Where do I start with this massive, massive book? One thing that a lot of people find helpful is something called reading plans. Reading plans can be found in a few different places online. There's an app that a lot of people like. It's called YouVersion. It's been downloaded by like 1 billion people or something. And it has a lot of reading plans in it. And a reading plan will provide you with references. You know, read this chapter from the New Testament and this chapter from the Old Testament. And those reading plans will often put things side by side to help you to connect things in context. Reading plans can be very helpful. They're also available in books, like Through the Bible in a Year and that kind of structure. But I wouldn't necessarily recommend starting with a reading plan. If you are very, very new to the Bible and you're not sure where to dive in, I would suggest beginning at the beginning. These 66 books, this collection of books, all tell one big story, something people sometimes call a meta-narrative. It goes from eternity through the history of humanity and into eternity, our beginning and our destiny. And as with any story, it makes sense to begin at the beginning. But which beginning? Because you've got a few options. There's a couple of different beginnings. If you pick up our Bibles that we have in their pew, turn right at the beginning to the beginning of the book of Genesis. It says page 1. There's a place where it says page 1. Chapter 1, verse 1. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. Now I can't get through reading those 3 verses without ending up with like half a dozen questions. Like, what on earth? It's beautiful, it's poetic, it's descriptive, it's evocative, but there are questions in there that people have been wrangling about and wrestling with since Genesis chapter 1. Everybody, if you start on page 1, everybody has questions in Genesis. Who was Cain's wife? What about Noah's Ark? Where's that now? What about the Tower of Babel? What was that all about? Everybody has questions in Genesis. Everybody stumbles over things in the book of Exodus. Everybody is either bored or offended by the books of Leviticus and Numbers. Everybody gets stuck in Deuteronomy. Absolutely everybody that's paying attention comes through the book of Judges either angry or heartbroken, or both. Those first few books of the Old Testament are a hard read. They are challenging, and I'm not telling you don't read them. I'm not sure it's the best place to start. You might be better, if you're just getting started, to start with the other page 1. Our pew Bibles are numbered funny. If you turn sort of near the, sort of 2/3 of the way through to where the New Testament begins, it starts numbering the pages again at 1. And I'm not a super fan of that because it is all one continuous book, but that's the way ours is set up. So maybe you're better to start with the Gospels, and this is what I would suggest. If you're beginning to read the Bible, start with the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. These 4 men wrote biographical stories, biographical accounts of Jesus' life, the things that he said, the things that he did, the places he went, the relationships that he had, what people thought of him, who he got mad at, and who got mad at him. And within each of the Gospels, there are lots and lots of allusions, lots and lots of connections, what some people call hyperlinks, back to the Old Testament. And those hyperlinks can help you start getting a handle on some of that difficult stuff in the Old Testament, providing context, helping you to see where the story is going from the perspective of the people in Exodus and Numbers and Judges. It helps us get a handle on how the Old Testament fits together and why the Old Testament matters, because the Old Testament does matter. So I would suggest starting with the Gospels, and in particular, I would suggest starting with Mark's Gospel. And in our Pew Bibles, if you're interested in taking a look there, I think it's on page 32. And you'll see there the scripture focus that Kat read for us this morning. This is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. As it is written in Isaiah the prophet, there's one of those hyperlinks to the Old Testament. And in those days, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee. And in the story that we read, Jesus is baptized by John the Baptizer, and he immediately goes out on his own into the wilderness to spend 40 days doing battle with our greatest enemy. And he sends our greatest enemy running away with its tail between its legs. And again, we have questions. We read these things, and we read the description of John the Baptist, and we go, wait, he was eating what? Locusts? Aren't those grasshoppers? Ugh. The gospel writers were each writing for their own community. So Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, they each had a particular audience in mind, someone they expected to be reading their book. Mark's gospel was written to a Roman audience. He wrote his gospel probably when he was living in Rome, about 3 decades after Jesus' death and resurrection. Mark wrote his gospel, his remembrances of Jesus, for fellow believers who were in prison, who were under the thumb of the infamous Emperor Nero. Brothers and sisters who were being arrested and tortured and executed. He wrote his gospel for and to believers who were struggling to live their faith in a culture, in a city, in a time when the best that you could hope for was that people didn't care that you were a Christian. But at worst, when they found out, they would want you to die in pain and humiliation. Mark was writing to people whose lives were at risk every time they had to choose between the politically expedient and what they knew to be true. Mark writes his gospel to remind them about Jesus, to take them back to first principles, to the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. He writes to take them back to that moment of God's great surprise, when this unexpected, out of nowhere, all of a sudden, ordinary Jewish man named Yehoshua showed up with his countrified accent, with his calloused working man's hands, with his clear eyes filled with surety and confidence. And Mark does not for a moment suggest that Jesus is just the nicest guy ever, well-intentioned, but maybe a bit naive. Mark writes about Jesus being indignant at what the world does to people's bodies and minds. being angry and distressed at their stubborn hearts, sighing deeply at their insistence on denial. He writes about Jesus being amazed at people's lack of faith, Jesus being distressed and troubled at the path that he had chosen to follow, a path of arrest and torture and execution. Mark also writes about the range of responses that people had to Jesus. He writes that people were amazed by Jesus' words. They were terrified at his power. They were trembling in fear at his greatness. They were astonished by his miracles. They were frightened and confused. They were overwhelmed with wonder. They were not understanding and afraid to ask. They were listening with delight. They were saddened by their inability to understand. Mark records that at one point, Peter broke down and wept. Mark begins his message to his suffering, struggling brothers and sisters with a promise fulfilled, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, "Behold, I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare the way." That is a promise fulfilled the minute that Jesus steps into the frame. And Mark concludes his message to his brothers and sisters with another promise kept, but this time with a twist. If you look at Mark chapter 16, verse 8, this is generally and credibly held to be the final original verse written by Mark himself in his gospel. It says this: "So the women left the tomb and ran away, trembling and bewildered, and in their fear, they did not say a word to anyone." This is a promise kept. Right from Genesis chapter 3, God has promised that he will bring victory over brokenness, victory over disenfranchisement, victory over estrangement, victory over death. Genesis chapter 3, verses 15 and 16. This is like humanity's worst hour ever. And God says to the enemy in the form of a serpent, "You have made yourself an enemy in this woman. You have made yourself an enemy in her offspring, and one day you'll bite his heel, and he will crush your head." That picture, that victory is repeated by the Apostle Paul in his first letter to the Corinthian church, chapter 15, verse 25. "For Jesus will reign until he has put all of his enemies under his feet, and the last enemy to be destroyed is death." Not J.K. Rowling, sorry. Apostle Paul, the last enemy to be destroyed is death. That is like the best news ever. That is the most amazing news ever. And these women are there and they are witnesses to the fact that it's happened. Enemy dead. Death has been destroyed. The grave is empty. But Mark tells us they were terrified. They were bewildered. They were trembling. And I think that the way that Mark tells his stories of Jesus, the way he reminds his brothers and sisters of Jesus' story, I think part of his intention in the way he crafted this book was to tell his brothers and sisters this: don't be afraid to be afraid. But don't be afraid of the wrong thing. I think he was telling them, I know your life is hard right now. There are genuine powers of evil stacked against us. But there is something that evil fears. There is life that death can't defeat. There is a power that the powers can't overpower. Jesus came from Galilee. Mark's gospel is a great place to start. It's the first one that was written of the four. Matthew and Luke borrowed from Mark's writings as a source for some of their own work. Mark's gospel is concise. It's the shortest gospel. It's quick-paced. The writing is clean and neat, and it is very, very relatable. We meet people like us. But above all, Mark, in writing to encourage the Roman Christians, including himself, to remember where they came from, Mark introduces them again to the Jesus who he himself met. Not a fictionalized Jesus of movies and memes. Not a cartoony Jesus of bumper stickers and tattoos. Not an abstract guru or a vague spiritual being. Not a romanticized victim. Mark introduces us again to the Jesus who chose to come looking for us, the Jesus who never lets us down, who was expected and anticipated and promised all the way back in the Old Testament, who not only lives today, but conquers and rules over death in all of time. The Jesus who will, in the end, again send evil running away with its tail tucked between its legs, but this time, forever. Mark's gospel is a great place to meet that Jesus for the first time. And I think that if you read it honestly, if you read it with an open mind and an open heart, you will find yourself starting to ask questions. You will find yourself starting to feel the sharp edge of change begin in your own heart and mind. And you will begin to hear the voice of the Spirit whispering and whispering. I think you will start finding that you're getting to know someone who, now that you've met him, it's going to be hard work to ignore him. This is the beginning of the gospel. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee. Action. You're telling me I have to read this? No. But you really, really should.